Right now, in the spring of 2026, there is a war unfolding in Iran, and I know that sounds like the headline, but I need you to hold on for a second because this story is so much bigger than Iran. It is a story about a man in Moscow who has been playing a very, very long game. And right now, without firing a single missile into the Middle East himself, without committing one Russian soldier to the region, Vladimir Putin may be watching everything he has spent the last 7 years trying to build fall right into his lap. Not because of something he did, but because of something America did for him. Russia's oil revenue doubled during the first 3 weeks of the Iran conflict. Let that sink in for a moment. Not increased slightly, not got a modest bump, doubled. And that is just the beginning of what we need to talk about tonight. So let's go back. Because to understand what is happening right now, you have to understand what Putin has been trying to do since at least 2019. You have to understand a doctrine, a worldview that he has been obsessively constructing, piece by piece, the way a chess grandmaster sets up a position 20 moves before the decisive moment. Russia's push for a multipolar world is rooted in the Primakov doctrine of the 1990s, which laid out 3 enduring goals: countering U.S. dominance, restoring Russian influence in the post-Soviet space, and halting NATO expansion. Putin didn't invent this vision. He inherited it, weaponized it, and made it the central operating system of his entire foreign policy. The idea at its core is simple and profound. The United States cannot be allowed to be the only pole of power on Earth. There must be others: Russia, China, Iran, and whoever else is willing to resist the Western-led order. And for years, Putin tried to build this coalition himself, from scratch, through sheer force of will and geopolitical maneuvering. He tried to hold Syria. He tried to hold Venezuela. He tried to hold Iran close. He tried to build bricks into something that could genuinely counter Western financial architecture. For Putin, multipolarity is not a rhetorical idea, but the concrete framework guiding Russia's foreign policy, through which Moscow seeks to consolidate its autonomy, reshape international norms, and challenge Western dominance. That has been the mission. That has always been the mission. But here's what's so fascinating and so deeply unsettling about this moment we are living through right now. Putin tried to build this multipolar world the hard way, and it kept not quite working. Syria fell. In late 2022, Kremlin credibility was dented by Moscow's inability to prevent a renewal of hostilities between Azerbaijan and Armenia, leading to the collapse of Russia's traditional security role in the South Caucasus. Venezuela's Maduro was pulled out of power by American forces in early 2026 in a daring raid that humiliated Moscow. And then Iran, the crown jewel of Russia's anti-Western alliance network, the country that gave Putin Shahed drones that rained down on Ukrainian cities, the country that signed a sweeping strategic partnership with Russia in January 2025, Iran got hit hard. Putin expressed condolences over what he described in an official message as the assassination of Iran's supreme leader. Khamenei, it's worth remembering, was only the latest friend of the Kremlin to fall. From Syria to Venezuela to Iran, Putin kept losing his friends one by one. And yet, and this is the part that you really need to sit with, something strange happened. Even as his allies collapsed, even as his partnership network crumbled, Putin started winning anyway, not because of what he did, because of what America did. Because Putin and his advisors likely determined that war in Iran serves Russia's interests in the short term: higher energy prices, global distraction from a Ukraine war that Putin is not ready to settle, and America at risk of entrapment in another Middle Eastern quagmire. Think about that construction for a moment. A war that America chose to fight for American and Israeli strategic reasons is producing dividends for the man sitting in the Kremlin watching it all unfold on his television screen. Let's talk about the money first, because in geopolitics, money is always the foundation that everything else rests upon. A combination of heavy sanctions and low oil prices had given Russia's energy industry a poor outlook just a little over a week before the Iran war began. Oil and gas revenues had fallen from 45% of Russia's federal budget in 2021 to around 20% in 2025. As sanctions imposed by the international community took effect, Russia was hurting. The sanctions were working, slowly but genuinely working, grinding down Moscow's ability to finance the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin's 2026 budget reportedly assumed an average Urals oil price of roughly $59 per barrel to balance the books. In late 2025, Urals prices were often well below that level, squeezing Russia's ability to finance its growing defense outlays. Putin was staring down a budget crisis. The math was getting ugly. And then Iran happened. Brent crude climbed to roughly $84 per barrel in recent days, while Russia's Urals blend surged well above the benchmark assumed in Moscow's 2026 budget. With disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz, Asian buyers have begun seeking alternative supplies, and Russian oil has emerged as a convenient substitute, enabling Moscow to reclaim market share lost to Iranian and Gulf exporters. Think about the geometry of this. Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz. About a fifth of the world's oil supply gets choked off. Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz has taken roughly 20% of the world's oil supply off the market, and the United States, at least temporarily, lifted sanctions and tariffs that limited the volume of oil Russia could export. So not only did oil prices go through the roof, benefiting Russian revenues, but the United States actually relaxed its own sanctions on Russian oil in the process, because the world needed supply and Russia had it. America, with its own hands, eased the pressure it had spent years building on Putin's war economy. That is not a minor footnote. That is a seismic event. It was forced to sell its oil at a discount of $10 to $13 a barrel before the U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran. Now it is selling at a premium of $4 to $5, according to Reuters. That swing, from a deep discount to a premium, represents an enormous transfer of wealth into Russian government coffers that fund the missiles hitting Ukrainian cities, the soldiers grinding forward in the Donbass, the entire machinery of a war that has now been going for more than 4 years. But this isn't just about oil money. The oil money is the part that's easiest to count, but it's not the most important part of this story. The most important part is what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine, while all of your attention and America's attention and the Trump administration's attention is fixed on the Persian Gulf. Washington's peace efforts are largely on hold while the White House is totally distracted by Iran. Months of U.S.-mediated talks between delegations from Moscow and Kiev have produced no breakthrough on the knottiest problems, such as who keeps Ukrainian territory and how to prevent future Russian invasions. These were talks that were actually making some tentative progress. They were slow, they were painful, they were deeply complicated, but they were real. And now they have essentially stopped. The Kremlin said that talks between Washington, Moscow, and Kiev on ending the war in Ukraine were on a situational pause following the start of the Iran war. A situational pause. That is the Kremlin's language. That is Moscow's way of saying, we are fine waiting. We are in no hurry. Take your time with Iran, America. We'll be here. And while America is distracted, what is Russia doing? Over the past weeks, the Russians have intensified pressure on the battlefield and in the air. In Ukraine's eastern Donbass region, Ukraine's industrial heartland long coveted by Putin, the situation is critical. Russia is pressing forward. It is launching strikes. Russian overnight missile strikes in February 2026 reached their highest intensity in 4 years of war, with some salvos including up to 30 ballistic missiles in a single wave. 30 ballistic missiles in a single night, while American headlines were about the Strait of Hormuz and Iranian drones over Gulf oil fields. Russian strikes on Ukrainian cities happening in the background, almost unreported, almost invisible behind the enormous flare of the Iran conflict. That is exactly the information environment that helps Putin. That is exactly what he needs. And then there is the weapons dimension, which is arguably the most tactically significant piece of this entire puzzle. The Patriot system forms Ukraine's backbone defense against Russian ballistic missiles. Every Patriot battery committed to defending Gulf cities is a battery that cannot be redeployed to protect Odessa or Kharkiv from Russian salvos. And every interceptor missile used over Riyadh or Abu Dhabi is one fewer available to intercept the next Russian ballistic barrage against Ukraine's power grid. Patriot missiles are not produced overnight. They are extraordinarily expensive, highly complex precision weapons. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar have all used Patriots in recent days to defend against Iranian ballistic missiles and Shahed-type drones, often firing million-dollar interceptors at Iranian drones that cost a tiny fraction of that. This is the brutal mathematics of modern war. Burning through your most sophisticated air defense inventory to shoot down cheap drones, while on the other side of the world, Ukrainian cities are left more vulnerable to the same kind of weapons coming from Russia. The Iran war is consuming precisely the resources that Ukraine needs most. That is not a coincidence of history. That is what the strategic analysts who think about these things call a force multiplication effect. And right now, it is multiplying in Moscow's favor. Now, I want to be honest with you here because this story has real complexity, and part of what we owe you is that complexity. Putin is not simply winning everything right now. There are ways in which this situation is deeply uncomfortable for the Kremlin, too. From Armenia and Syria to Venezuela and Iran, Moscow's inability since 2022 to aid its allies in times of crisis has seriously damaged Russia's reputation as a global power. Russia signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran in January 2025, and when the bombs started falling on Tehran, Putin could do essentially nothing. He issued statements. He expressed condolences. He called for de-escalation. He positioned himself as a potential mediator. But he did not and could not materially defend his partner. Whatever Russia does, its strategic room for maneuver is shrinking. Iran has been more than a diplomatic partner for Moscow during the Ukraine war. It has been a critical military enabler. Iran gave Russia the Shahed drones that changed the character of Russia's air war against Ukraine. That partnership is now severely disrupted. That supply chain is now in question. That is a real loss for Putin, not a trivial one. Strategically, the war forces Moscow into a series of painful choices. Support Iran too openly and risk direct confrontation with Washington while destabilizing key energy routes for China, its most important economic partner. Distance itself from Tehran and undermine the partnership that helped sustain its war in Ukraine. These are genuinely difficult dilemmas. Putin is caught in what the geopolitical analysts at Geopolitical Monitor have called a Zugzwang, a chess term for a position where every move you can make only worsens your situation. Russia has been effectively cut out of the diplomacy to end the Iran conflict, as the Gulf states, Pakistan, and Turkey take the lead. For a man who has spent decades insisting that Russia must be at every major table, being cut out of the most consequential diplomatic process in the Middle East in years is a genuine humiliation of prestige. But here is the thing about prestige versus power. They are not always the same currency. And what Putin cares about, what he has always cared about most, is not being admired, but being effective. And right now, the cold, hard metrics of effectiveness are moving in his direction in ways that matter for the thing he cares about above all else: Ukraine. Higher, more stable energy revenues reduce the economic pain of continued conflict and make it easier for President Vladimir Putin to persist in his apparent strategy to wage war until the West gives up and withdraws support for Ukraine. That is the through line of this entire story. Putin's strategy in Ukraine has never been complicated. It has always been outlast them, outlast Western resolve, outlast Western unity, outlast Western attention, make the war so long and so costly that eventually the democracies lose interest and Ukraine is left exposed, and everything that the Iran war is doing, spiking energy revenues, consuming Western weapons, fracturing diplomatic attention, pausing peace talks, all of it extends Putin's ability to pursue exactly that strategy. Zelensky put it plainly. For Putin, a long war in Iran is a plus. In addition to energy prices, it means the depletion of U.S. reserves and the depletion of air defense manufacturers. So we have a depletion of resources. Zelensky is not someone who dramatizes these things unnecessarily. He has had 4+ years of practice at reading exactly how global events connect to his country's survival. And his read is, this helps Putin and it hurts Ukraine. Here is the deeper historical context that ties all of this together, because what we are watching right now did not begin in February 2026 when the bombs fell on Tehran. What we are watching began in 1999, when a former KGB officer watched NATO bomb Yugoslavia and decided in his bones that Russia had been humiliated long enough. It continued in 2007, when Putin stood up at the Munich Security Conference and told the assembled leaders of the Western world to their faces that the unipolar moment was over. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov gave his New Rules of the Game speech in February 2020, in which he said the Kremlin would no longer tolerate the dual policy towards Russia of doing business with one hand, but applying sanctions with the other. That was not rhetoric. That was a declaration of a new operating posture. Putin spent years trying to build his coalition of resistance, China, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, into something that could genuinely redistribute global power. He wanted to create the multipolar world through his own construction. But what he could never quite achieve through construction alone, the Iran war may be delivering through disruption. Because here is what disruption does. It fractures attention. It reshuffles resource priorities. It forces great powers to choose where they focus their finite energy. And every time America chooses to focus somewhere other than Ukraine, Putin benefits. Not only does the Iran war fallout weaken U.S. leverage over both combatants, but its economic and military consequences will give both Kyiv and Moscow incentives to slow-walk diplomatic efforts. Peace in Ukraine is likely a long way off. And so here we are. Vladimir Putin, the man who spent 7 years building alliances, writing doctrines, conducting military interventions, trying to assemble the architecture of a multipolar world where American power would be constrained, that man is now watching a war he did not start, did not plan, did not want in the form it has taken, produce many of the outcomes he could not produce himself. His oil revenues are surging. His battlefield enemies are getting fewer Western weapons. His peace talks have been suspended. His soldiers are pressing forward in eastern Ukraine with diminished American attention on what they're doing. And the global rules-based order he has spent his career undermining is looking, from the outside, more fractured than it has in decades. Nothing weakened the United States quite as much as 20 years of open-ended conflict in the Middle East. Not only did America's wars create opportunities for Russia to project power in the region, but its botched withdrawal from Afghanistan emboldened Putin to test U.S. credibility by invading Ukraine. We have been here before. We have watched this movie. Every time America gets consumed by a Middle Eastern war, someone in Moscow sits back and watches the vacuum open up. The question this time, the question that keeps serious national security thinkers up at night, is whether America can fight on one front without abandoning the stakes on another. Whether the United States can hold its attention, its weapons, its diplomatic energy, and its resolve in two places at once. Whether the lesson of the last 20 years has actually been learned. Because Putin is watching and he is patient, and the clock is running in ways that serve him rather than us right now. And that is not a reason for despair, but it is a reason, a very serious, very urgent reason, for eyes wide open. The world is being reshaped. The question is whether Americans are paying close enough attention to what is actually happening while they watch the fires burn in the Persian Gulf.